Welcome to our session. So we are. This is really not about us getting up and showing slides, but really about generating a discussion. So we can talk a lot, but we're really interested in your input and kind of getting questions from you and having a discussion with the whole group. So what we thought we'd do is we'll start with just kind of some introductions, but each of us are going to talk about kind of a little bit about what we do and what kind of ethical issues and ethical and equity issues that we've kind of identified and addressed. And so we'll each kind of give about 3 to 5 minutes, and then we are going to open it up for general discussion with the whole group. So why don't we start with Aaron, begin with the A.
Thank you. It's great to see so many of you and great to hear so many ways that your programs are engaging with ethics. One of the things that the three of us were really impressed with kind of preparing for today's panel was what were we going to hear today and yesterday around ethics and ethics engagement and equity, and there's been a lot. So I think we'll have a really lively conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm Aaron Goldenberg. I am a professor of bioethics at Case Western Reserve University. I also direct a new center called the Center for Community Health and Genomic Equity, focused on issues related to the intersection between genetic research and equity and health disparities. So what I thought I might do is just give a couple 30,000-foot view thoughts about where I think we need to be and where I think we need to be going as it relates to ethics and equity in genomic newborn sequencing, genomic newborn screening, and then hand it over to my colleagues who will kind of give a little bit more on-the-ground experience and things that they've been working with in their own programs related to ethics and equity. I have kind of my 3 or 4 main points. The first one is the importance of ethics in context. We've heard a lot today and yesterday about newborn genetic sequencing, newborn screening, public health versus clinical models. And I think it's going to be incredibly important for us to, just as we have precision medicine and precision public health, to have precision ethics. We need to be very thoughtful about the models that we use to support and justify ethically the work that we do and how that may be different in public health settings and in clinical settings. The models that were used in the 1960s and 70s to support mandatory newborn screening look very different than they did now. I'm not suggesting we don't have mandatory screening. I'm not going to get kicked out. But what I do think we need to do is to think really strongly and really thoughtfully about where our programs sit, who we engage with, what are our conduits to patients and families, and what kinds of ethical models do we need to have and to think about in order to build governance structures and ethical structures that will both benefit families and protect families and protect newborns. And that may mean thinking differently in clinical contexts and public health contexts. It may mean needing to think about clinical utility different in these different settings. We've heard this a little bit today, but we know that the kinds of conditions being added to newborn screening panels are challenging some of our original notions of kind of the ethical justification for newborn screening. We're talking about conditions that have higher phenotypic and genotypic variability. We're talking about conditions that have more invasive treatments. We're talking about conditions that may have variable ages of onset. We need to be thoughtful about how those differences and those distinctions as programs evolve necessitate us to take a step back and think about the ethical frameworks that we're using. So we heard a little bit yesterday and today about this kind of distinction between treatment and clinical utility versus personal utility. And for me, I think even from an ethics standpoint, those distinctions are a lot blurrier than I think we can make them to be, right? So if we think about things like the importance of genomics for educational interventions, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, these are all areas that we may not have traditionally put into traditional clinical utility, but are clearly benefiting families and benefiting newborns. So we need to make sure that our ethical models are meeting those demands. We heard a lot today about consent frameworks that are online, that are using dynamic consent forms. We need to also be thinking about how those may need to differ in these different kinds of settings. So if we're thinking about a dynamic online consent process, what does that look like in a public health setting versus in a medical setting? So I think we just need to think about existing and new models that we'll need to make these important distinctions. The second thing I want to talk about is the idea of ethics and equity. And what I mean by that is both in research and clinical settings, we talk a lot about diversity, and diversity is incredibly important. And in a research setting, we've talked a lot over the last couple of days about the importance of having diverse participants in our studies. And I'm absolutely in line with that thinking. But we need to talk about what we do next. We have to widen our lenses of equity beyond just inclusion. We need to be thinking about what do we do after we have our diverse samples? How do we involve diverse participants in prioritization of research questions? How do we involve participants in decisions around equitable distribution of benefits? How do we think about more diversity in the researchers who are accessing our samples? We talk a lot about open source data, and I am a strong believer in open source data, but we have to make sure that our ability to create equality in access to our samples and data don't actually create more inequities in the outcomes of how those data are used. So we need to be thinking really dynamically about kind of how we conceptualize equity beyond just inclusion. In our clinical settings, we also have to think, our brilliant colleague, Amy Gaviglio, who's here, talks a lot about access not equaling equity, right? We need to make sure that as we think about access, that again is just the start. If we think about access as the floor, we need to make sure that we have equitable access to new technologies, to new genomic sequencing platforms. We have to think about other things like families who need to travel in order to get care, daycare, work flexibility, things that sometimes are harder to ascertain, harder to capture, are still incredibly important in equity in the work that we do. I also want to say sometimes I hear in meetings like this the idea that, well, we just got to get the technologies out. We got to get the technologies out and eventually it'll be available to everybody. In many ways, for me, it sounds a little like trickle down equity, right? Like, everyone will get it eventually. We have to reframe the way we think about those things. We have to think about equity from the beginning, from the start, from the design of our studies, from the essence of what we're doing, not hoping that at some point in the future, our technology will be available to everybody. We have to build that in from the beginning. And finally, I want to say something about trust, which is that we've heard a lot about the importance of building trust and getting communities to trust us and building those relationships. And I want to flip that on its head a little bit and say those things are also really, really important. But we have to, as a consortium, as a group, think about building trustworthy institutions and trustworthy programs. And that is the way we start building those relationships. It's not just about getting people to trust us. It's about creating trustworthy work and trustworthy institutions. And then my last thing I'll say is we've been hearing a lot about the importance of a consortium, of working together. And so my last point is about ethics and partnership. I think sometimes ethics is seen as a barrier. Sometimes it's seen as a naysayer or a hand-wringer. We need to make sure that we're including ethics in all the various work that we do. And I've been incredibly impressed by the work you're all doing. And I think that there's a lot more to be done. There's good data out there, but there needs to be more, and we need to work together as a consortium in kind of ethics and partnership and equity and partnership as well. So I will stop there. I'll hand it over. I'm looking forward to all your comments.
Okay, well, thank you, Aaron. There's a lot of points I agree with you on there. Trickle-down economics didn't work, and I don't think trickle-down equity is going to work either. My name is Tshaka Cunningham. I'm really pleased to be with you all today. I wear a number of hats. I like wearing hats. One of the first hat that I wear is I'm a PhD molecular biologist and genomics researcher. I'm also a biotech entrepreneur now. Formerly a pharmaceutical industry researcher. And then first and foremost, I'm a person of color. I'm African American. And that is something that, carries a lot of meaning for me and someone who's part of one of these underrepresented groups we keep talking about when we're talking about diversity. And as a result of that, being an African American researcher and wearing these different hats, I was told today at lunch that I'm actually an N of 1. I don't believe that. I feel like there's some others out there. I was told I was an N of 1 because I'm also an ordained Baptist deacon. So I'm deep in the faith community. I'm a person of science, a person of color, and someone who's experiencing this conversation about diversity in real time. And so I'm here just to share some thoughts and backgrounds on what I've come to in this. I've been working on trying to improve diversity and inclusion in genomic studies since I worked in the government. I worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs, which under President Obama, if you all remember, back in 2015, he started the Precision Medicine Initiative, which is now known as the All of Us program. There were kind of two branches of that. There was the NIH All of Us program, right? And then there was the Million Veteran program. And while I was at the VA, I was actually able to work as part of the Million Veteran program to help work out how we were going to get minority veterans to participate, and learned a ton from that. And I'll share some of those insights as we have this conversation. But what the most important lesson I took away from that experience, and that MVP program, I want to give the VA a lot of credit because that's one of the cohorts that actually has done well with diversity. I think, at least from an African American perspective, African Americans are only about 12% of the veteran population, but they're about 18% of those represented in that MVP cohort, which now has almost 900,000 samples, right? So it's going to be one of the richest data sets that we have, particularly for African American males in the world, or people of African descent for that matter. So some of the lessons I learned from that, and some of the lessons that I learned in the work that I do in the community, is that trust is probably the most important feature. But in our society, because of the dirty, unfortunate history of our society, trust with specific populations has been, I'm not going to say irreparably, but definitely really damaged. And so when you think about some of the episodes throughout history that have led us to the situation that we're in now, we're working against that backdrop of history to try to really establish new trust relationships with communities. But I'm here to tell you that as difficult as that work will be, it can be done. And one of the organizations I work with that I really enjoy working with is called the Faith-Based Genetic Research Institute. We're a small 501c3 nonprofit. We started just before the pandemic, and the goal was to go into mostly minority churches, particularly African-American, historically African-American churches, and share this information about what is genomics, what is genetic testing, and why is it important to you? And we've seen just a dramatic reception and a positive reception once the information is shared on terms that people can understand. And we've actually developed a philosophy. We call it the honest broker communication strategy, which is the people who are imparting the information to the community are actually from the community. All right. So if I'm going into a majority African-American church, I will have African-American researchers with me, as well as other researchers, but having predominantly African-American researchers with me to deliver the message and to really establish the bonds of trust. And I think that that's something that it could be a good lesson for everyone trying to do outreach work. I mean, I was just at a huge conference out in San Diego, the Illumina Genomics Forum, where this word diversity was I must have heard it 100 times, right? But I always felt like diversity, just saying it without thinking about, like, saying we need more of it is not increasing it. You know, so that's why I'm hoping that we can have a really frank and open discussion here about equity and inclusion, and what does it really mean to build trust and grow diversity, particularly in historically underrepresented populations that don't necessarily have the best trust of the medical establishment. These are things we have to not only grapple with, but figure out if we hope to make a dent on this problem. But I'm here to tell you that we can. So I'll stop there and let's have our discussion.
All right, so I would just introduce myself. So I'm Ingrid Holm. So I'm at Boston Children's Hospital. I'm a medical geneticist, and I'm the co-PI with Robert on the BabySeq program. And I thought I would just, so a little bit of a different discussion, but just thought I would share like some of the kind of ethical things that are lessons learned as we went through the initial BabySeq project and now this current BabySeq project. So the initial project, as Robert talked about, was a randomized controlled trial, which, and again, in and of itself, has some ethical issues. And it's also a little bit of a different paradigm than some of the other studies being done, in that we have participants who had sequencing and didn't. And this really allowed us to start to look at the impact on families of having sequenced, because we had a control group to compare to. And so that also kind of gets to, I thought I would just share some of the issues that our IRB had with our first BabySeq project. So it took us a year to get through the IRB, and there's a lot of concerns about risk. And the risk was primarily the risk to parents to getting this information. And by having this randomized controlled trial, we really were able to show in the long run that there weren't a lot of risks, and families, as Robert showed you, actually did fairly well with it. The other kind of interesting piece was their concern about the family. So this hasn't really been brought up much, but the way that as IRB thought about we're doing newborn sequencing, we're not just giving information about the baby, but each parent has half of the genes that the baby has. And so their concern was about the implications for family members of getting information on their baby. And in fact, we had to enroll biologic parents into the study because of this concern that they had. So I'm just bringing it up there. It's a while ago, but it's kind of an interesting concern that we haven't really talked about as much about implications for family members. The other concern that they had was putting information in the medical record. And so it was, as we think about, making it risk kind of diagnoses of potential risk, what that does in terms of insurance. Of course, we have GINA, but other kinds of insurance about risk information being in an electronic medical record, kind of what that means. And again, we haven't really talked about that, but it's just something to note that the IRB was concerned about. The other was consenting, and we've talked, I think, kind of a lot about consenting and different models of consent, but their real concern was that with a 27-page consent form, it's a realistic concern, do parents really understand what they're getting into? So I think that's something as we're doing research in this area that we just have to kind of be aware of this idea, do they really understand what they're getting into? And we, in fact, had a questionnaire at the end of the consent session that asked some very basic questions just to be sure they kind of understood what the consent issues were. So kind of turning to then this kind of as we've been talking about, kind of this issue of diversity. And so what happened in BabySeq2 is that we offered enrollment in a very diverse setting, which was primarily the Brigham and Women's newborn well baby nursery and the children's NICU. And so those are very diverse communities, or lots of diverse populations there. But the people who enrolled were white, well-educated. I think there was somebody who enrolled that worked at the Broad. I mean, it was really, it was a lot of those, that type of demographic that enrolled for a variety of reasons, and much of it is people who really weren't interested in research. And so now we're really, in BabySeq2, going to diverse communities, and the way that we're handling it is to actually go where people are. And so we're going out into communities to try to enroll the more diverse communities. So along those lines, when we first got our, the study section first reviewed our grant, they told us it was unethical. And they said it was unethical because we weren't considered, for two reasons. We weren't really adequately considering the diverse communities that we're enrolling in, and that we weren't providing support for healthcare providers getting this information. So again, I'm just sharing this because it's kind of interesting to see how other people view what we're doing. And we really took that to heart. And as it turns out, we did have plans that we hadn't written out, but we basically have gone and really tried to, with that kind of feedback, to really get more community engagement, which is a lot of what we've been talking about here. The other kind of issue is this issue of the healthcare providers. And I know it's different places. Genome England has a different relationship with their providers, but they were really concerned that we were going into kind of underserved communities, working in health centers that were low resourced health centers, and giving information back to providers that they wouldn't know how to really handle. It would be kind of overwhelming to them. And so we kind of instituted our procedure of really doing a genetics education for providers in these community, in health centers, and then enrolling their patients. So I just thought I would share some of the kind of on the ground issues that came from other people, like the IRB in the study section, as they thought about our studies. And a lot of the things that I'm talking about here are things that I think a lot of the studies that have been highlighted over this conference have really discussed. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll kind of open it up for discussion. I first should say that if you guys have something you want to say to kind of start it off.
Yeah, it's after lunch. I'm kind of feeling a little low energy. So why don't we do a little physical experiment? I like this. Everybody, we've got a nice full auditorium here. Let me ask all of you all who would group yourself as an African American, describe yourself as an African American, please stand. Okay. All right. Okay, now you can sit down. All right. All of those who would group yourself as white, please stand. Okay, sit back down. Anyone, I'm going to put another box, not to cover all the boxes, and please excuse me, other. If you consider yourself not white, not African American, please stand. Okay. Good representation. All right, everybody sit down. Okay. Now, all of you all that stood up as white, please stand up again. Now, all of you that stood up who consider yourself white, that has a close friend that's black or African American, please sit down. Now, all the rest of you standing, I want you to come out to me later and we're going to be friends, all right? All right, everybody stand up. And let me have my African American stand up again. All of those who have at least one friend who's Caucasian or other, not African American, please sit down. We all sat down. So, and I would do that for the others too. Others stand up. So nobody's left out. All of you who consider yourself other, who have a close friend that's African American, sit down. Okay, a couple of you are going to find me later too. Of the others, please stand up. All right, others, please stand up. All the others who had a close friend that was Caucasian, please sit down. Okay, still we got work to do. All right, so that exercise, that social exercise, that little social experiment just taught me two things. One, we're grossly underrepresented for diversity in this room. So we're gonna work on that next year. That's a goal. Looking at this room, we had almost 200 people, only about 3 of us stood up as African American, and I'm one of them, so I don't know if I really count because I'm sort of a panelist, right? So we're gonna work on that. And then 2 was the friend issue. And I think this is the frank discussion I wanna have with everybody, and this is where I want us all to do better as a community. We tend to put ourselves and stay in the boxes that wherein we're grouped. That's the trouble with race. I hate race as a concept, but it's something we grow up with in our societies. You're assigned to a box. Now, me growing up in the United States, in inner city Washington, to black parents, I was assigned to a box. You're a black male, young male, all right? And that box decides how everybody views me and also how I view everybody else, right? But that's dangerous because genetically speaking, I'm actually in several boxes. And that's how we are. We're admixed most of the time, and there's a lot of interesting traits that we're gonna learn, not only about all the babies we're gonna sequence, but as we all get sequenced. But it's going to take all of us, if we really want to build diversity, right? All of us are gonna have to be friends to each other. And that's what I think is missing in the field. When you think about how people get jobs, how people find out about opportunities, is through friendships and connections. So if we really wanna bring people in, all of us are gonna have to lower our thresholds and be more friendly to one another. There's a scripture in the Bible that says, or it's not in the Bible, it's often spoken in churches, that he who would have friends must show themselves friendly, right? And so I want to leave you guys with that message, and I want us to all think about that and challenge ourselves to, if we were among those groups that were still standing up, where we didn't have enough friends of the different groups, go out of our way to make friends in those groups and make those connections, because those connections are very powerful, and those are going to be the things that help us solve these issues. Fun, right?
All right, so let's open it up. Do people have questions, things they want to bring up? Go ahead. Yeah, yeah, you can just yell. Yeah. I mean, yelling is fine, but if there's a microphone around, that's good.
Okay, so we heard you both talk, actually all 3 of you talk about the importance of trust, which of course I completely agree with, but I think the concept of trust is a lot more nuanced than you either trust the program, you trust the research, or you don't. So I'm wondering if you can kind of elaborate on what trust looks like in your eyes and how we might know when we have achieved the notion of trust.
Aaron, you want to start with that?
Sure, I'll start. I think for me, how do you know when trust is established? I think when you truly are in partnership, when you truly are working together, when your participants are not just participants, when you see them as having their own expertise, bringing their own voices to the table, when their voices can be heard, when our participants feel empowered by being in our studies. It's not just about, I trust you enough to sign this consent form. It has to be more than that. It has to be dynamic. It has to be engaged. I also think that we have to have champions for each other, just as we have to be friendly with each other and friends. We have to have champions for each other. A lot of participants in studies that I've done in Cleveland, they don't really trust the healthcare system, but if they can find a research group that they trust, that they feel that is listening to them and their community, that goes a long distance to building trust all over the place, right? It doesn't have to be, there's not going to be a silver bullet that will just solve trust everywhere. Just as you're saying, it's dynamic, it's nuanced. It also means being present and listening and listening and listening. And engagement has to be a two-way street. It can't just be about educating people. It has to be about listening. And only through that kind of listening do you actually build trust.
Yeah, I 1,000% agree with what he said. And Aaron, I don't know if you're going to talk about some of the work you do in barbershops, right? But we were having a conversation where he's doing some work in Cleveland, going into black barbershops and, having the barbers be the ones that contribute the messages and the information about the studies. I think that's really smart because the work that I've seen in churches, the pastor in the black church tradition is one of the most trusted figures. It's not a coincidence that Martin Luther King came from the church, right? And the whole civil rights movement grew out of the church because it was one of the only places that people of color, particularly black people, could go and feel safe and get information. And it's still that way to this day. So if I got my pastor, the pastor of my church, and my church is about 30,000 members, to say, you all need to get newborn screening, guess what? There'll be a line, right, to contribute samples, the next week, right? So it's having that trusted communicator in the populations you're trying to reach out to that have worked hard to establish trust and to know, to educate them about why what we're doing is important as a community. And so I think that is going to be something that I hope we do a lot more of, and it'll go a long way to establishing, rebuilding trust where it had been damaged.
Other questions? Yep.
I got a loud voice. There's a microphone. It's better for the online folks to have the mic. So
disadvantaged life experience can show up in the epigenome, and that can cross generations. How important is this dimensionality to genomics to include, to really fully address issues of diversity and equity?
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, I think the answer is and some other people who are more kind of into the basic science than I am can maybe also address this. But I guess my answer would be very important, but that we don't do so much about that we don't know. So I think that, starting to think about kind of epigenomics and how those, it's inherited and how that kind of goes through is very important, just not as well, difficult to get at and not as well understood. But if anybody else has any comments about that, I would welcome their comments.
Well, we lived through the George Floyd episodes and the things that were going on. Black lives matter. Black genomes matter. We need more African genomes, period. I was at a meeting again last week where I learned that less than 2% of all the genetic information in the databases come from the continent of Africa. That is crazy to me because Africans were a founder population for us as humans. So we're doing all of ourselves a disservice if we allow that to persist, number one. Secondly, I'm really curious to all the variants we haven't discovered, right, in these populations, and what do they mean? So as a person of color, I'd really like to know what the variants that come from my populations are. And I think that goes for many of us. So I think we really, there's knowing what those variants mean and how they affect us. I mean, my company, Polaris Genomics, we're developing genetic diagnostics for mental and behavioral health disorders. So we have an algorithm built on a set of polygenic risk markers that can show you, this individual's predisposition to develop PTSD if they experience traumatic stress. But what we don't know enough about is resilience. Did my ancestors going through slavery make me more susceptible or resilient to these phenotypes? We don't know. We don't have enough information, but that's the whole reason why we're doing all of these research studies. Definitely need more.
I totally agree. And I'll just add one more thing, which is that I think we need to spend more time thinking about how to integrate social, economic, and other kinds of determinants of health into the work that we do. If we're going to look at intergenerational trauma, if we're going to look at intergenerational issues, we can't just rely on genetics and genetic data. We have to really think strongly about how we involve social determinants of health, economic determinants of health, environmental determinants of health, and integrate those in really robust ways in our work. It's really, really crucial. And I know many of you and many of the projects that I work with are already starting to think dynamically about how to do that. And we need to, as a group, think about how to do that together.
Yes, over there.
So I have a couple questions. What responsibility do researchers have to inform these diverse participants about the ways in which genomic data, although it can be really useful in medicine, is also used by the criminal legal system in surveillance? So to go into these communities and talk about how only 2% of them have given their data and how much you could help them, and not also mention that their genomes, sure, they're starting out in their, in their medical files, but it's not difficult for police to obtain a subpoena to get that data. So we could see it as possibly like an eventuality that that same data will be part of, will be used to surveil them and everyone related to them. So yeah, I guess what responsibility do researchers have to make this point when they're also making the point about all the ways that this could maybe help them and their communities? And at what point is it just irresponsible to add, like to, essentially throw like gas onto the fire of over-policing in this country, especially considering that police have often used genetics, like wielded it as a weapon. Their spit and acquit programs where they will stop mostly Black men on the street if they don't have ID or if they just fit a certain profile, will require that they give genetic data to be freed. So yeah, I guess it's just, I want to move away from this thinking of genetic data is always good and getting more of it is always good. Sometimes it will only be used to surveil. And then my second question is, at what point does a lack of enrollment and a lack of trust serve as an answer? Like, when does no mean no? When is it not that we need their pastors to tell them to do this, or we need to educate these groups more? At what point do groups deciding that they do not want to be a part of this and don't want to risk surveillance serve as an answer in of itself, especially among people who are in like Native American communities? They've talked about the fact that this data will be shared, can be traced back to like their ancestors, and in some of those communities, it's like group elders and group leaders have made it very clear they don't want this data out. So when does people voting with their feet and voting with their actions of saying no going to be respected as the final answer?
Everybody's looking at me, right? So I can answer that. Well, someone who would be at risk, I was in New York during the stop and frisk like heyday, and I was terrified as a young Black male in graduate school going, and it was around the time of the Amadou Diallo shooting as well. So as a young Black man, that's something that I do consider. And I think what it means for all of us is that we, as the purveyors of this technology, the ones who are generating it, the folks who are doing the research and coming up with the studies, are going to have to really have a strong moral and ethical compass so that we guide ethically its application. That is a real concern, and that's not the first time I've heard it or considered it from the population, particularly of African Americans who are already, the word was used, over-policed and harassed often by the criminal justice system. Now I'm giving you my DNA, so that's going to let you do it more efficiently? No. We don't want that. So, but I think there's a way, the risk of that compared to the benefit of what would be gained for our communities, at least in my opinion, the benefit of potential gain is greater still. I don't know that people are necessarily voting with their feet yet. I don't feel like people have even known that there was an election going on, right? So that's kind of, we need to like give people the knowledge about what's happening and give them the information, the pros and the cons, so that they can really make that decision. I don't think this stuff as a community writ large has been communicated well enough, not just to Black and brown populations, but to the entire population. Less than what, 4% of people have ever been sequenced? So that means 96% of the rest of the world still needs to catch up. But I think that is a valid concern, and it's something that we need to consider when we're making ethical frameworks on what we do with this information.
Yeah.
We need to wrap up.
No, we need
So,
to wrap up. I'll just
let's
say
comment.
I absolutely agree. I also think I would say yes, we need a lot more transparency about how data and samples may be used, how they may not be used. And so we need transparency on one end. We also need to develop governance structures, operating procedures, and state and federal policies that protect samples, that protect research samples, that allow individuals and families to feel protected when they decide to participate in research studies, and we need them now. We need those kinds of governance structures now. And then to your second point, I do agree. I think sometimes we focus so heavily on getting people to say yes that we sometimes dismiss absolutely valid and true and meaningful reasons why people may say no. And when we build our structures in ways that only focus on the yes, we have two problems. One, we avoid those genuine no's. We also, I think, sometimes don't pay enough attention to why someone might be saying no, why they're speaking with their feet, why they're worried about particular things. We need to have better engagement in order to address those things. And I know our next speaker is going to talk, Natasha Bonham is going to talk a lot about engagement and why those kinds of structures are so important for families.
Thank you very much. We will now end the session and go on to the next speaker.